Star Trek, for almost 60 years now, it's been this absolute giant of science fiction. I mean, it's inspired generations with its whole vision of the future. But lately, especially the era that's being led by executive producer Alex Kurtzman, it's become, well, a real flashpoint for arguments. So today, we're going to dive into a pretty significant online critique that tries to break down this whole modern era, arguing that it's all built on basically a flawed foundation.
So the source we're digging into today actually grabs this exact quote from Alex Kurtzman and, get this, uses it as the absolute core of its entire argument. The whole critique basically says that this one idea, this single sentence, shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what Star Trek is all about. And they say it's the key to understanding pretty much every single complaint people have about the new shows. All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the source's take on this core philosophy. Then, we'll see how the critique says this philosophy actually plays out in the shows themselves. After that, we'll get into the supposed conflict with the audience. And to wrap it up, we'll cover what the source thinks is the only way to move forward. Okay, first up, the philosophy. So the core argument of this entire critique is that modern Star Trek is it's operating from a completely different playbook than the older shows. And, according to the source, that's changed the very nature of its storytelling. And this really gets to the heart of it. The critique argues that classic Trek, right, was all about exploring these huge, timeless ideas. Good versus evil, logic versus emotion. And it tried to do it from a kind of objective, neutral point of view. But it claims that Kurtzman Trek is way more focused on sending a very specific message about things happening right now, and it does that by looking at them through what the source calls the writer's own subjective, even partisan lens.
And here's how they say it worked. The argument is that classic Trek created these allegorical races that were basically stand-ins for different parts of us, of humanity. You've got the aggressive Klingons, the logical Vulcans, the super greedy Ferengi. By doing that, the show had this built-in way to look at ideas objectively. You could just take any concept, throw it into the mix with these different viewpoints, and a really complex story would pretty much write itself.
Okay, so how does this all translate to what we actually see on screen? Well, that brings us to the second part of the critique. The source ties this whole philosophical argument directly to the creative decisions being made in the new shows. And yeah, the source really doesn't pull any punches here. It lays out these really blunt one-line descriptions for who it thinks each show is for. I mean, the argument here is pretty clear. The franchise isn't being made for its original, more intellectually focused fan base anymore. Instead, it's been all broken up to try and hit these totally different, separate audiences. Now, this next point is absolutely crucial to the critique. It's a term the source actually invents called care-based morality. And the idea is that in the new shows, big ethical problems aren't solved with science or objective justice anymore. No, they're solved based on how the characters feel. Their internal emotional state has basically become the final word on what's right and wrong.
And to give an example of this, the critique points to speculation about the upcoming Starfleet Academy show. It sort of predicts a scenario where a character uses their feelings, an emotional connection, to find someone all the way across the galaxy. The source calls this idea magic science and argues it's the perfect example of feelings just completely overriding the kind of logical, science-first problem-solving that used to be the bedrock of the franchise.
So, what happens when you have this huge philosophical divide? Well, that brings us to part 3. The supposed breakdown in the relationship between the show's creators and a big part of the fan base. The source claims it's even led to, open hostility. And for its main piece of evidence, the source points to this alleged tweet from Robert Picardo. You'll remember him as the Doctor on Voyager. It holds this up as a prime example of a creator just lashing out at critical fans and argues it's a sign of a much broader, more dismissive attitude from the people in charge.
And from that point, the critique actually pivots to an economic argument. It breaks down the power dynamic, and it's pretty simple. Step 1. A huge franchise like Star Trek gets its value from the passion of its fans. Step 2. If you alienate or insult that core fan base, they leave, and the value of the franchise goes down. So the conclusion is that creators who attack their fans are literally harming their own product's bottom line.
All right, so where does all this leave us? Well, in its final section, the critique delivers its verdict on the legacy of this whole era and lays out a very specific and honestly pretty drastic plan for how to fix things. The solution, according to this critique,
It's a total reset. It says you've got to remove the current leadership and writing staff, then hire writers who are actual longtime fans who really respect the canon. And this is a big one. Stop making prequels. The source argues that prequels are just a way to avoid being held accountable to the established timeline. Instead, it says, go back to the Golden Age and continue the story right from where series like Deep Space Nine and Voyager ended.
So what's the ultimate fallout if none of this changes? Well, the critique argues that all the shouting online, all the angry debates, all that controversy, that's not actually the biggest threat to the franchise.
No, the source claims the real damage, the true legacy of this era, is something much quieter. And, in its view, a whole lot worse.
Apathy. That's the final word. The source's ultimate verdict is that the worst thing that could happen has already happened. It claims that for every one fan who's online yelling about the shows, there are 10 more who haven't just gotten angry. They've just stopped watching. They don't hate it, they don't love it, they just don't care enough to even have the argument anymore. And the biggest threat, it argues, isn't the hate. It's the silence of an audience that's already changed the channel.
And that really leaves us with a big question to think about, right? For a franchise this beloved, with such a long history, what's the greater danger? Is it the loud, passionate, messy arguments from people who still care deeply? Or is it the quiet indifference of people who don't care at all anymore? It's really a question about the soul of a fan base and the future of an entire universe.